golden age of higher education, a time when American higher education rose to fame and fortune. Higher education had come to be a major focus of attention in the formulation of public policies at both the state and federal levels. College enrollments in the late 1930s, prior to World War II, were just under 1.5 million. Post-World War II enrollments in the late 1940s had jumped to almost 2.7 million, an increase of about 80% in just one decade. In 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known to most as the GI Bill. This act provided financial assistance for veterans of World War II who wished to pursue higher education. The GI Bill was a milestone in the federal funding for education of individuals and did much to break down the economic and social barriers to allow millions of Americans to attend college. Not only could all veterans who satisfied the published eligibility criteria be guaranteed education benefits, but they could also use these benefits at any institution of their choice, so long as it met criteria for government approval. By 1945, 88,000 veterans had applied and been accepted, and by 1946, GI Bill college enrollments had surpassed 1 million. In 1947, the Commission Report, popularly known as the Truman Commission Report, proposed many changes to higher education, such as abandoning the European concepts of education, doubling college attendance by 1960, integrating vocational and liberal education, eliminating racial and religious discrimination, expanding federal support for higher education, and the establishment of a network of public community colleges that would charge little or no tuition, serve as cultural centers, be comprehensive in their program offerings with emphasis on civic responsibilities, and would also serve the area in which they're located. This report marked the first time a U.S. president deliberately extended federal inquiry into nationwide education issues, which had been left with state and local governments. While it did bring the federal government into the nationwide discussion about higher education, it was not without controversy. Its recommendations ran the risk of encouraging federal intrusion into state and local policies, and some say it moved too far, too fast, and had neither the precedent or presidential clout to work its way into congressional subcommittees.
In 1945, one major area of federal policy focus was on further developing the sciences and advanced research in higher education. Vannevar Bush's report, titled Science, the Endless Frontier, set the tone, claiming that while westward expansion geographically had ended, scientific expansion was endless. Bush's vision was not to fund all research, but to create a competitive arena for grant proposals to be selected by peer review for government projects. Thus, the terminology of big science was the best science was created. Bush's vision of creating a federal agency focused on advancement of scientific research would later become the National Science Foundation, which currently provides research funding for K-12 educators, undergraduates, and graduate-level students. The impact of Bush's work did not end here, as his work launched the start of the federal government's involvement in higher education research through multiple other arenas, such as the Department of Health, Defense, Energy, and Agriculture, with perhaps the medical field being transformed most drastically. By 1960, the federal grant university term was coined due to higher education receiving approximately $1.5 billion in federal grant money. By 1960, federal financial aid was also in full swing, with the federal government being the largest source of support for higher education in America. Throughout the Cold War, much like during other wars, higher education was seen as a public good that was going to save us from nuclear war, much like the duck and cover concept during this time. Unfortunately, the push for higher education to save us from attack was quite costly, and by the end of the Golden Age, taxpayers began to revolt, which eventually led to the Great American Tax Revolt in the mid-70s.
As the 1960s began, college students across the country found their voice in the form of activism. Young people had become disenchanted with the cookie-cutter life of the 1950s. They were frustrated with the failed progress of the war in Vietnam, and at home, they were ready to take a stand against segregation and injustice. While the names Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks are synonymous with the civil rights movement, the reality is that hundreds of college students were involved. In fact, one of the earliest examples of student activism came in February 1960 when 4 college friends from North Carolina A&T University made the decision to take a seat at a whites-only lunch counter. Within a few days, these students were named the Greensboro Four as they unknowingly launched a national sit-in movement that spread to dozens of cities and included over 3,000 college students. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was born out of the sit-in movement and was the first activist organization of its kind run by young people. SNCC held meetings across the Southeast and encouraged students to join the movement and stand up against segregation. While SNCC's primary focus was the civil rights movement, the group eventually spread their cause to include voting rights and voter registration laws, as well as opposition to the Vietnam War. By 1964, students across the country began to express frustration with their college experience. While universities were enjoying increased enrollment, students were experiencing what they referred to as the impersonality of the multi-university. Rather than allowing students to vocalize their discontent, administrators replied with newly enforced restrictions and policies. In response, Mario Savio, a UC Berkeley student, led the charge known as the Free Speech Movement. This movement empowered college students to speak out about the Vietnam War, women's liberation, integration, and many other causes. David Labaree refers to the perfect mess of higher education when he wrote, "Altogether, the 100-year rise of the American system of higher education, from poverty and disdain in the 19th century to riches and acclaim in the 20th, is one of the all-time great institutional success stories. However, while this time may have been the golden age of American higher education, it was also a time when college students began to use their voice and were unfortunately met with pushback from administration. This led to protests, some of which included violence on many campuses. By 1970, the golden age had regrettably become a perfect mess."
I wage